Here's one scene you never saw on the BBC series Coast. The reason? A year ago, these ships weren't here. This afternoon, the River Fal in Cornwall was full of idle container ships. Trade is slowing down, globalisation going into reverse, even as the politicians pledge to keep it going.
We have not yet seen the same protectionism in trade with beggar-thy-neighbour policies such as the 1930s, and I will fight hard to ensure we do not. But we also need to ensure that we do not exercise a new form of financial protectionism or mercantilism, a retreat into domestic lending and domestic financial markets.
If you want a graphic illustration of what's happening, look at Japan. Its finance sector was not badly hit, but as a major exporter, it's a good thermometer for what's happening. Japanese exports fell by 35% in December. Its imports fell too, but only by 21%. In December 2007, Japan was a net exporter. Now it's a net importer. Meanwhile, in the USA, imports have fallen 10% and exports by 4%. The result of all this is that the US trade deficit has collapsed by 27%. And it's the same in the EU. Year on year, exports down 11%, imports down 4%, even trade within the European Union is down 14%. We're living through the biggest trade contraction the globalised economy has ever seen, but at least it's not the result of any conscious policy. The bigger worry is what's happening to the finance system, because there, the fragmentation flows directly from the various national bailout packages. At the G20 summit in November, the leaders called for a global fiscal stimulus. The IMF has called for tax cuts and public spending rises to the tune of 2% of world output. The first risk comes if this is not delivered.
I think everyone understands the need for fiscal stimulus, and I'm hopeful that we will see it in the US, in Europe, and in Asia, both in Japan and in China. But if it doesn't happen, then we're in the world of beggar thy neighbor, and that's not a world that we want to see.
Problem number two comes once it is delivered. Obama's $800 billion stimulus is designed to be spent in America.
I continue to be optimistic about our ability to get this recovery package done to put people back to work.
National spending programs in America, China, Germany and here do what they say on the tin. They're a state, not a global solution. There are big differences too about the way bank bailouts are being handled. In Europe, some banks have been nationalised. In the USA, help has come in the form of state lending direct to businesses, and now probably nationalising the debts. But it all comes at a domestic price.
The taxpayer interest clearly is important, because taxpayers want to know that they're getting some value for money, and that value for money includes some protection, if you like, for domestic lending. But the danger with this is that there's no guarantee as a result of that the capital flows which have been so important in recent years in developing the global economy will be maintained at their current level.
The fragmentation of global finance is a serious possibility. First of all, because if banks do go back to simply taking deposits and lending them out, they're reliant on a smaller pool of national capital. And on top of that, there's the flight from risk. With currencies bouncing about all over the place and countries going bankrupt, who wants their pension fund invested abroad? But for the opponents of globalisation gathering in Brazil this week for their annual forum, deglobalisation is not a threat. It's a strategy whose time has come.
Globalization in its old form is over. People have seen that the neoliberal model of free markets and deregulated markets has not worked. It's failed the poor, and it's now failing everybody around the world. What comes next is a new form of managed internationalism, where you don't have people being subservient to banks and people being subservient to the ideologies of the free traders. You have it reversed, so that now trade, finance, capital should be made subservient and to be made to serve the needs of the poor.
Globalisation created huge imbalances in the world economy. America imports, China exports, American consumers borrow and spend, and Chinese consumers mainly save. We always knew that had to be rebalanced, and we now know the process will be disorderly, but it might not happen at all.
In recent years, Germany has embraced globalization. Its economy has benefited from it. But facing what's expected to be its worst recession since World War II, Germany has certainly become much more inward-looking. That's hardly surprising, really, when you consider that Germany is so reliant on its exports. And when customers abroad suddenly don't have the money to buy German cars or chemicals or machine tools, then action is needed back home to save jobs and boost the domestic economy. That's exactly what the economic stimulus packages adopted by the government here are designed to do, by funding national infrastructure projects and easing the tax burden. But what you don't see from Germany or from other European countries is any real appetite for a pan-European approach to tackling the global downturn. Each country is coming up with its own thing, its own package. True, last December European leaders did sign up to a joint fiscal stimulus package, but the final document was rather watered down, partly because the Germans had publicly opposed the idea of paying money into a joint European pot and then seeing it disappear into the unknown. Now add to all of that the fact that German banks have cut their cross-border lending to reduce their risks, and you get the impression that for the moment at least, Europe's largest economy is concentrating on saving itself.
As the world economy slowed, China hoped that its salvation would lie here, with its own domestic consumers on its own high street. This is a country that grew rich through exports, but the thinking was that a rising middle class with more money to spend than ever before would keep China powering along. Well, it turns out that these consumers are just as frightened as everyone else. Spending has been falling here. Car sales have dropped for the first time. The housing market has ground to a halt. So the government now is turning to the countryside. It hopes that by starting a national social security system, by building new houses for farmers, and by offering peasants discounted consumer goods, it can keep the economy powering along. China's salvation, then, lies in peasant power.
Here in Brazil, they're still hoping to avoid the worst of the economic crisis. But it's clear even a developing country can't avoid its share of pain. Car and steel producers have been laying off some workers and putting others on temporary leave. And December's job statistics were the worst in 10 years. Front page news here today has been about the Brazilian government increasing bureaucracy to slow down imports and protect jobs. And it's been reported that both foreign and Brazilian firms have delayed or abandoned plans for about $30 billion worth of investments across various industries. So new tax breaks have been offered to the worst affected sectors, such as car producers. A year ago, South America's biggest country was growing at about 5 to 6%, exporting everything from orange juice to iron ore. Now Brazil, with a population close to 190 million people, is hoping that a big internal market will help it to ride out the storm.